we're told, emergency plans for a, quote, reasonable worst-case scenario that includes rationing electricity during peak hours in the morning and the evening. It's as blunt as that. We're joined by Tony Lodge, an Energy and Infrastructure Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Tony, thanks for coming to the studio. Really appreciate it. You were just explaining during the headlines there, we've got a bigger problem now with potential power cuts than we had in the 1970s. Our homes are so much more electrified than they were.
That's right. So you had household heating in the 70s and the 60s and that period into the 80s, where a lot of people still use solid fuels. And you could effectively heat your home independently of being on the electricity grid. Everything is now electrified, far greater than it ever was. The boiler relies on an electric brain to tell it when to come on.
The kids go do loudly because there's no Wi-Fi.
The Wi-Fi, the whole nature of the electric home, if we want to call it that, is dependent on electricity. Now, that means that the scenario we've got at the moment, which, by the way, we predicted 10 years ago in this document with the Centre for Policy Studies, we called it the atomic clock, how the coalition is gambling with Britain's energy policy, 2012. We made it quite clear that far too much what we call baseload generating capacity, the big coal-fired power stations of the Aire Valley, the Trent Valley, and over in the northwest and the south, we're being allowed to close, but there was no net replacement coming on instead. A renewable portion of weather-dependent power does not replace a coal-fired power station or an oil-fired
power station. Will always keep generating electricity even when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining.
Absolutely, and that applies to the older nuclear power stations as well, such as the Magnox plants, which we let go. So you get to a situation where simply, if you tot up the numbers as we did in 2012, something wasn't fitting. And it didn't fit, and it isn't fitting. I fear the government's going to try and start importing more and more power from the continent. The problem with that is the continent has its own issues, and we will only get that power if we're prepared to pay a high price. We really have a major problem looming.
Ella Whelan.
It's one of those things that I think a lot of the discussion, for obvious reasons, tends to focus around the issue of Russia and what's happening in the immediate moment. And yes, nobody planned for this, and certainly nobody, even at the start of the year, we didn't think this was on the horizon. But I think the point about, even going back to, 2012, or the fact that this has been an issue in the making for a very long time, and there's been a sort of insubstantial and even bordering on crass discussion around electricity supply, which is that whether it's electric cars or the kind of green agenda, there is this kind of idea that it will just come from nowhere, that if we, get rid of nasty coal, dirty pollutants, things that are horrible, and everything's going to run on solar power or electricity, and your electric car is going to be wonderful. And of course, no one's asking the question, where are the plants that are being built to meet this demand? Where is the long-term kind of infrastructure plans, or, even the kind of ideological drive to say, this exciting thing, electricity, getting cleaner energy, great, but where from and how? And for people who, are lay people who don't understand this, what it really looks like is that this plan has been written on the back of a fag packet a number of years ago and hasn't had any thought to it, and now we're going to be asked to pay the price.